The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town square of Redemption Creek, casting harsh shadows across the weathered faces of men who had spent lifetimes under its unforgiving glare. Everett Kane stood apart from the crowd, his calloused hand clutching 2 quarters, the sum total, of his worldly wealth, while the most powerful, ranchers in 3 territories gathered around the auctioneer's platform. The auction had drawn every landowner of consequence. They came in their finest clothes, their polished boots kicking up small clouds of dust as they positioned themselves for the best view. Sterling Maddox stood at the front, his silver-embroidered vest catching the light, a man who wore his wealth like armor. His ranch sprawled across 20,000 acres, and his word carried the weight of law in these parts. "Next item," the auctioneer called out, his voice cracking in the dry heat. "Widow Henderson's old barn and the half-acre it sits on. We'll start the bidding at $5. Silence fell over the square. Men shifted uncomfortably, exchanging knowing glances. The Henderson barn had stood abandoned for 3 years, its reputation as cursed as the land it occupied. Everyone remembered how Elias Henderson had left town in the dead of night, his family packed into a single wagon, never to return. $5? The auctioneer tried again, his enthusiasm waning. Surely someone wants a barn and land for $5. More silence. Then from the back of Sterling Maddox's throat came a sound, a chuckle that grew into full-throated laughter. His associates joined in, their mirth echoing off the false-fronted buildings lining the square. "I'll give you 50 cents, Everett heard himself say, his voice steadier than he felt. The laughter stopped abruptly. Heads turned. Sterling Maddox's eyes, gray as gunmetal, fixed on Everett with an expression somewhere between amusement and contempt. 50 cents? Sterling repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. "Boy, that barn's not worth the nails holding it together, but even I wouldn't insult the widow by offering 50 cents. 50 cents, Everett repeated, stepping forward through the crowd. Men parted before him like water around a stone. "It's all I have, and it's all that property's worth, according to you gentlemen who've been laughing about it." The auctioneer looked uncertain, glancing between Everett and the assembled ranchers. "Any other bids?" Sterling Maddox waved his hand dismissively. "Let the fool have it. Maybe it'll teach him about knowing his place in this world." The gavel came down with a crack that seemed to echo into eternity. Sold to Everett Kane for 50 cents. As Everett counted out his coins with trembling fingers, he could feel the weight of their stares. They saw a nobody, a drifter who'd been doing odd jobs around town for the past year. They saw someone beneath their notice, someone whose failure would be inevitable and entertaining. What they didn't see was the pattern Everett had noticed during his reconnaissance of the property 1 week prior. They hadn't observed as he had, the way the morning sun revealed peculiar markings on the back wall, symbols that his grandfather had taught him to read during long evenings by the fire, lessons about the old ways of marking valuable land. 3 decades earlier, Everett's grandfather, Benjamin Kane, had been one of the finest surveyors in the Western Territories. He'd carried a leather-bound journal filled with detailed drawings and explanations of the symbols used by those who located water, minerals, and valuable land features. Before his death, he'd passed that journal to young Everett with a solemn instruction. "Knowledge is the one treasure no man can steal from you, boy. Learn to see what others overlook, and you'll never go hungry." Everett had memorized every page of that journal during the lean years after his grandfather's passing. While other boys learned to rope cattle and break horses, Everett studied the language of surveyors, a secret code hidden in plain sight across the western landscape. Now, standing before his newly acquired property, he felt the weight of that knowledge pressing against his chest like a physical force. The barn leaned dramatically to one side, its boards sun-bleached and warped. Gaps between the planks were wide enough to throw a cat through. The roof sagged in the middle, missing so many shingles it looked like a smile with half its teeth gone. But Everett wasn't looking at the decay. He was looking at the marks. As the crowd dispersed, still chuckling about the fool who'd thrown away his last money, Everett approached the barn with the rusty key the auctioneer had given him. His hands shook as he inserted it into the ancient padlock. Behind him, he heard Sterling Maddox telling his foreman that some people simply couldn't be taught to respect their betters. The lock clicked open with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The door groaned on corroded hinges, swinging inward to reveal an interior that made Everett catch his breath. Outside, the barn appeared ready to collapse in the next strong wind. Inside, however, told a different story entirely. The floorboards, though covered in years of accumulated dust and debris, were solid oak, expensive timber that would have cost a fortune to transport to this remote territory. The support beams stood straight and true, showing none of the rot that should have claimed them. The interior space was vast and hollow, creating an acoustic chamber that made Everett's footsteps echo with unusual clarity. Something about the sound felt wrong, too resonant, as if the floor beneath him was hollow. He moved toward the back wall where he'd spotted the markings from outside. Up close, illuminated by shafts of sunlight piercing through the gaps in the walls, they were even more remarkable than he'd remembered. Carved deep into the wood were symbols he recognized immediately from his grandfather's journal. His heart began racing as he traced them with his fingertips, feeling the deliberate grooves carved by someone who knew exactly what they were documenting. These weren't random scratches left by livestock or weather. These were surveyor's marks, the kind used to indicate significant discoveries. But why were they carved inside the barn, hidden from casual observation? The answer came to him with sudden clarity. Whoever made these marks wanted the information kept secret. They documented their discovery in a code that only other surveyors could read, hidden inside a structure that appeared worthless to discourage investigation. Everett pulled out his grandfather's journal and began cross-referencing the symbols. His hands trembled as he confirmed what he'd suspected. These particular marks indicated a water source of exceptional quality and volume. Not just a spring or shallow well, but something significant enough to warrant the secrecy. In this territory, where a single year without rain could destroy a ranch and drought could last for seasons, water wasn't just valuable, it was power itself. Men killed over water rights. Fortunes rose and fell based on access to reliable sources. Sterling Maddox's empire had been built partly on controlling the best water sources in the region, and now Everett held the key to what might be the most valuable water source in 3 territories. The confrontation came sooner than Everett expected. He'd barely begun his preliminary survey when Sterling Maddox appeared in the barn doorway, accompanied by 2 of his largest ranch hands. "Funny thing, Kane," Sterling said, his expensive boots thudding against the oak floor. "I got to thinking about your little purchase. Couldn't sleep last night, wondering what would possess a man to spend his last coins on a worthless property." Everett straightened from where he'd been examining the floor, quickly stepping away from the area he'd been investigating. Sometimes a man just wants a roof over his head, even if it's full of holes. Sterling's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Is that so? Then you won't mind if I take a closer look at what you bought." He moved toward the back wall, his fingers tracing the carved symbols that Everett had been studying. Interesting decorations these, almost look like some kind of markings. You wouldn't happen to know what they mean, would you? The question hung in the air between them like a drawn blade. Everett realized with cold certainty that Sterling knew more than he'd let on at the auction. Perhaps he'd always known about the water source but lacked the knowledge to interpret the surveyor's code. Or perhaps he'd tried to force that information from Elias Henderson and failed. "Just old carvings," Everett replied, keeping his voice level. "Previous owner probably got bored during long winter nights." Sterling turned to face him fully, and Everett saw something predatory in his expression. "I've decided I was too hasty letting this property go so cheaply. I'm prepared to offer you $5 for it, 10 times what you paid. That's quite generous for a pile of rotting wood, don't you think?" But Everett had seen the hunger in Sterling's eyes, the slight tremor in his hands as he examined the symbols. This wasn't generosity. This was desperation wearing the mask of kindness. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Maddox, but I'm not interested in selling." The words seemed to suck the air from the barn. Sterling's facade of friendliness cracked like sun-dried leather, revealing the ruthless man beneath. "Not interested?" His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Boy, you don't seem to understand how things work in this territory. Men like me provide protection for men like you, provided you understand your place in the natural order of things." The 2 ranch hands stepped forward, their massive frames blocking the doorway. Their hands rested casually on the handles of their knives, not a direct threat, but clear enough to make their point. Everett calculated the distance to the door and didn't like his odds. But his grandfather had taught him that when cornered, sometimes the only option was to stand taller than your fear. I understand plenty, Mr. Maddox. I understand that you're suddenly very interested in something you claimed was worthless yesterday. Makes a man wonder why you'd bring armed men to make a simple business offer. Sterling's face flushed red above his embroidered collar. You insolent whelp. Do you have any idea who you're talking to? I own more land than you could walk across in a week. I provide employment for half this town. And you, a nobody with nothing, think you can stand here and question me? Funny thing about respect, Mr. Maddox, Everett replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. It has to be earned, not demanded. And from where I'm standing, you earn yours through fear rather than merit. The larger ranch hand moved forward, but Sterling raised his hand to stop him. His eyes never left Everett's face, measuring, calculating. You're making a serious mistake, Kane. This territory has ways of dealing with people who don't understand their place. Accidents happen. Barns catch fire. Young men disappear while looking for work in distant territories. The words conjured an image in Everett's mind. Elias Henderson fleeing in the night with his family. Is that what happened to Mr. Henderson? He asked. An accident that convinced him to abandon his own property? The question struck home. Sterling's composure slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly beneath the civilized veneer, a glimpse of the violence he was capable of ordering. Henderson was a weak man who didn't appreciate the generous partnership I offered him. He chose to leave rather than accept reasonable terms. Now Everett understood the full picture. Sterling had discovered the water source somehow, perhaps by accident or through rumor. He'd tried to force Henderson into giving him access, probably offering a partnership that would leave Henderson with nothing while Sterling controlled everything. When Henderson refused, Sterling had made his life unbearable until he fled. Well, Mr. Maddox, I'm not Mr. Henderson, Everett said, straightening to his full height. And I won't be intimidated into giving up what's rightfully mine. Now, unless you have legal business here, I suggest you leave my property. The silence stretched between them like a bowstring pulled taut. Sterling's jaw worked soundlessly, his face cycling through shades of red and purple. Finally, he spoke in a voice that promised retribution. You've made your choice, Kane. Remember that when the consequences come calling. The three men filed, out of the barn, leaving Everett alone in the sudden silence. His knees nearly buckled with relief, but Sterling's parting words echoed ominously in the empty space. The real battle was just beginning, and Everett knew he was outmatched in every way that mattered: money, influence, and raw force. That evening, as Everett sat outside his small rented cabin studying his grandfather's journal by lamplight, he heard a soft knock at his door. Violet McCall stood on his threshold, her simple dress clean and modest, her intelligent eyes regarding him with concern. Violet was the daughter of James McCall, one of the few independent ranchers who hadn't been completely crushed under Sterling's thumb. She worked as a school teacher, and Everett had always admired her quiet strength and sharp mind. Evening, Everett, she said. I heard about your purchase today. The whole town's talking. He gestured for her to sit in the chair beside him. Let me guess, they think I'm a fool. My father says you're either brave or foolish. He hasn't decided which yet. She studied his face in the lamplight. But I think you see things others don't. Remember last spring when you predicted that storm? Everyone said you were imagining things right up until the hail destroyed half the crops. Everett had based that prediction on his grandfather's teachings about reading cloud formations and air pressure changes, another piece of knowledge that set him apart. You found something in that barn, didn't you? Violet asked quietly. His silence was answer enough. She leaned closer, dropping her voice to a whisper. Be careful, Everett. There are people in this town who don't want anyone else to succeed, especially someone they consider beneath them. Sterling's already made his position clear, Everett replied. Violet's expression grew troubled. There's something else you should know. Sterling came by our place tonight asking questions about you. He wanted to know about your family, your background. My father told him to mind his own business, but she hesitated. Sterling seemed very interested in why you would spend your last coins on something everyone else considered worthless. The weight of her words settled over them like a heavy blanket. If Sterling was already investigating him, It meant Everett had less time than he'd thought to secure whatever lay hidden near the barn. "There's more," Violet continued, her voice barely audible now. "Before she left town, Widow Henderson asked to speak with me privately. She said to tell whoever bought the barn that her husband didn't abandon it by choice. He was forced to stop working there, she said." Violet paused, choosing her words carefully. She said that some men would rather destroy what they can't control than let others prosper. The pieces of the puzzle were forming a clearer picture, but it was one that suggested danger lurked much closer than Everett had imagined. Sterling Maddox wasn't just greedy. He was ruthless enough to drive a family from their home and vindictive enough to destroy what he couldn't possess. As Violet prepared to leave, she placed her hand briefly on his arm. "My father and some of the other small ranchers have been talking. They're tired of bowing to Sterling's threats. If you need help, you won't be standing alone." After she left, Everett sat in the darkness, weighing his options. He could sell to Sterling and walk away with his life intact, or he could fight for what he'd discovered and risk everything. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "A man who won't stand up for what's right doesn't deserve the blessings he's been given, boy. It ain't about winning or losing. It's about whether you can look yourself in the mirror when it's done." The decision was made. He would see this through to whatever end awaited him. Dawn broke cold and gray as Everett returned to the barn with his grandfather's surveying tools. The brass compass and measuring chains had helped locate water sources across 3 territories in Benjamin Kane's capable hands. Now they would either confirm Everett's suspicions or prove him a romantic fool. Inside the barn, he began following the carved symbols methodically. Each mark corresponded to a specific direction and distance in his grandfather's surveying system. The pattern led him in a careful spiral from the back wall toward the center of the structure. As he worked, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Every measurement brought him closer to the truth, and with it, closer to a confrontation he might not survive. The final symbol pointed directly downward. Everett knelt and began scraping away decades of accumulated dirt, hay, and debris from the barn floor. His knife blade struck something solid, not wood, not stone, but metal. His pulse quickened as he cleared away more material, revealing the edge of an iron cover roughly 3 feet square. The cover bore the same surveyor's marks as the wall, along with an inscription that made his breath catch. E.H. 1847. God's blessing runs deep. Elias Henderson's father had made this discovery decades ago and had hidden it well. This wasn't just any water source. Based on the inscription and the placement, this had to be an artesian well, the kind that produced fresh water continuously without pumping, driven by underground pressure that could last for generations. In a territory where droughts could extend for months and water determined who survived and who was ruined, such a well was worth more than gold. With proper irrigation, it could transform thousands of acres of marginal land into productive farms and ranches. Heavy footsteps approached the barn. Everett quickly scattered hay over his discovery and stood just as Sterling Maddox entered, this time accompanied by 4 of his ranch hands. The men spread out, positioning themselves strategically to block any escape. Sterling advanced with a predatory smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "You know, Kane, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I've come to realize that you're not nearly as foolish as you appeared at that auction. In fact, I think you knew exactly what you were buying." He walked to the back wall, his fingers once again tracing the carved symbols. "I've lived in this territory for 20 years. I've made it my business to know about every water source, every valuable piece of land. When Henderson lived here, I suspected he had something worth keeping secret. But the old bastard wouldn't tell me what, and his son was just as stubborn." Sterling turned to face Everett directly. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me what these symbols mean, and we're going to work out a fair partnership, or..." He paused, letting the threat hang unspoken in the air. "Or your barn is going to have an unfortunate accident, and you'll be lucky to walk away with your life." Before Everett could respond, one of Sterling's men produced a torch already lit, as if they'd come prepared for this exact contingency. "Wait," Everett said, his mind racing through options. "You're right. I do know what the symbols mean. They indicate..." "Save it," Sterling interrupted. "I'm done with your lies and half-truths. I'm going to search this barn myself, and if I find what I think I'm going to find, you'll be lucky if all you lose is the property." He signaled to his men, who began spreading out through the barn, probing the floor with metal rods, checking the walls for hidden compartments. It was only a matter of time before they discovered the iron cover Everett had partially uncovered. "You know what the problem with men like you is?" Sterling continued almost conversationally. "You think the world should be fair. You think that because you found something, you deserve to keep it. But that's not how the world works. The strong take what they want and the weak accept their place. It's the natural order of things." One of the ranch hands called out from the center of the barn. "Boss, I found something here. Metal under the floor." Sterling's smile widened. Well, let's see what young Mr. Kane has been hiding from us." But as his men began clearing away the hay and debris, Sterling made a decision that would prove to be his greatest mistake. He ordered his men to set fire to the barn's exterior walls. "Since you're so fond of this old pile of wood, let's see how you like watching it burn," he said. "After the fire, no one will question my claim to this land." Tragic accident, really? Everyone knows these old barns are death traps. Everett watched in horror as torches touched the dry wood. Flames spread quickly, fed by decades of accumulated tinder in the dry climate. Within minutes, the exterior walls were engulfed, fire racing toward the roof with terrifying speed. Sterling and his men backed away from the heat, satisfied that their work was done. Everett could only stand helplessly, watching years of Henderson family history and his own hopes disappear into smoke and ash. But as the flames reached the center of the barn, where the iron well cover lay exposed, something extraordinary happened. The intense heat caused the metal cover to expand and shift. Underground pressure that had been building for decades found a weak point in the seal. Suddenly, with a sound like thunder, a geyser of crystal-clear water erupted through the burning building. Water shot 20 feet into the air, arcing across the flames like a miracle made manifest. The artesian well, under tremendous pressure for generations, had finally found release. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Water cascaded down in sheets, dousing the fire and sending Sterling's men scrambling backward in shock and surprise. Within moments, the fire was extinguished, leaving only smoke and steam rising from the sodden wreckage. And through it all, the water continued to flow, a steady, powerful stream that created a growing pool around the barn's foundation. Sterling Maddox's face had gone white as parchment. He stood frozen, watching a fortune in water pouring from the ground, realizing that his attempt to destroy the evidence had instead revealed it in the most dramatic way possible. "Impossible," he whispered. "There can't be that much water." But the evidence was undeniable. The well wasn't just good, it was phenomenal, producing more water per minute than any source Sterling had ever seen. Everett found his voice, and with it, his courage. "Seems like God has a sense of justice after all, Mr. Maddox. Now the whole territory can see exactly what you tried to steal from me." The smoke and the spectacle had drawn attention. People from town were already riding toward the site, attracted by the column of smoke and now staying for the miracle unfolding before them. Within an hour, it seemed like half the territory had gathered around Everett's property. The water continued to flow steadily, creating a pool that reflected the afternoon sun like liquid silver. Word spread quickly through the crowd about what Sterling had attempted to do, how he'd threatened Everett, how he'd set fire to the barn, how his greed had been exposed by the very disaster he'd orchestrated. Thomas Whitman, the elderly store owner, arrived carrying the territorial land records. He climbed onto a nearby wagon bed so everyone could hear him clearly. "According to these documents," he announced, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "Everett Kane is the legal owner of this property and everything on it, including mineral and water rights. Any attempt to claim otherwise is theft under territorial law." Sterling's ranch hands shifted uncomfortably, realizing they'd been witnessed committing arson in front of dozens of people. Their employer's carefully cultivated image as a respectable businessman was crumbling like ash in the wind. "This is absurd," Sterling sputtered, trying to regain control of the situation. "The boy bought a worthless barn for 50 cents. He can't possibly have legal claim to water rights worth thousands, maybe tens of thousands of dollars. Actually, he can." A new voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. A well-dressed man in his 50s stepped forward, his clothing marking him as someone of professional standing. "My name is Daniel Collins. I'm a territorial surveyor and land assessor. I arrived in town early and witnessed this entire confrontation. He approached the flowing water and began taking measurements with professional instruments drawn from his saddlebags. The crowd watched in respectful silence as he worked, documenting the flow rate, testing the water quality, and examining the well's construction. After several minutes, Collins straightened and addressed the assembled crowd. "This is clearly an artesian well of significant capacity and exceptional quality. Based on my preliminary assessment, this well could sustainably irrigate several thousand acres while providing drinking water for both livestock and human consumption." He turned to face Sterling directly. "According to territorial law, water rights belong to the legal property owner regardless of the purchase price. Mr. Kane bought this property in a legally conducted auction, making his claim to these water rights absolutely valid." Violet McCall pushed through the crowd to stand beside Everett, her presence lending him strength as he faced down Sterling's increasingly desperate glare. "My father and the other small ranchers have been talking," she said quietly, but her words carried in the sudden silence. "They're tired of being bullied into unfair deals. Your discovery has given them courage to stand up for themselves." James McCall, Violet's father, stepped forward from the crowd. "She's right. Sterling, you've been pushing people around this territory for too long, using your wealth and influence to take what you want. Well, it ends today. We've all witnessed what you tried to do here, and we're not going to stay silent anymore." Other voices joined his, ranchers who had suffered under Sterling's manipulations, farmers who had lost water rights through intimidation, townspeople who had been forced to accept unfair prices for their goods because Sterling controlled the markets. The crowd's mood was shifting decisively against Sterling Maddox. People who had remained silent during years of his domination were now speaking openly about his methods. The attempt to burn down Everett's barn had been the catalyst that broke their collective fear. Sterling realized his position was untenable. His men were vastly outnumbered by an increasingly hostile crowd. His actions had been witnessed by an official territorial representative who would certainly file a report with the territorial government. Public opinion, which he'd always carefully cultivated, had turned against him completely. For the first time in years, Sterling Maddox found himself powerless and everyone could see it. "This isn't over, Kane," he growled, but the threat carried no weight. Everyone present could see that it was indeed over. Sterling's empire, built on intimidation and control, was crumbling because one young man had dared to say no. As Sterling and his demoralized men rode away, the crowd began to celebrate. People congratulated Everett, shook his hand, and thanked him for standing up to the man who had made their lives difficult for so long. Surveyor Collins approached Everett with documents to sign. "I'll need to file an official report and conduct a more thorough survey," he explained. "But I can tell you right now that you own something extraordinary here. That well could transform this entire region." As the sun set that evening, Everett stood beside the still-flowing water with Violet at his side. "What happens now?" she asked. Everett looked around at the faces of people who had never shown him respect before, people who now looked at him with admiration and gratitude. More importantly, he thought about what his grandfather had taught him about responsibility and community. "Now we build something better than what was here before," he said. "This water belongs to everyone who needs it, not just to me. We'll create a system that ensures no single person can ever control this region's water, the way Sterling tried to." 6 months later, Everett Kane stood on the hill overlooking what had become the most prosperous cooperative ranch in the territory. The artesian well now supplied water to a network of irrigation channels that fed not only his land, but also the smaller farms of his neighbors. The mineral-rich water had transformed the region exactly as legend claimed it would. Crops grew twice as fast. Cattle put on weight better than anywhere else in 3 territories. Horses developed stronger coats and stamina. What had once been marginal land suitable only for sparse grazing had become a garden. Sterling Maddox had left the territory entirely after facing charges of attempted arson and intimidation. His former holdings had been divided among the settlers he'd previously oppressed, creating a community of small farmers and ranchers rather than one man's empire. Everett had built his house on the hill overlooking the well. From his front porch, he could see children playing near the water's edge while their parents worked fields that had never been more fertile. The sound of flowing water had become the heartbeat of a thriving community. Violet approached from town, carrying a letter bearing official territorial seals. They'd been married 3 months earlier in a ceremony attended by what seemed like the entire territory. "The governor's response to your proposal," she said, settling beside him on the porch steps. Everett opened the letter with hands that no longer trembled with uncertainty. The territorial government had approved his plan to establish a cooperative water-sharing agreement that would prevent any single person from controlling the region's water resources in the future. The Henderson Well, as it had been officially named, would be managed by an elected board representing all the stakeholders. Henderson would be proud, Violet observed, watching the water flow steadily from the ground that had once seemed worthless. His discovery is helping people he never even met. Sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones we share rather than hoard, Everett replied. He thought about how different his life might have been if he'd kept the well's existence secret, if he'd become another version of Sterling Maddox. As the sun set over their transformed land, painting the flowing water in shades of gold and crimson, Everett reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. A 50-cent purchase had changed not just his life, but the lives of everyone in the territory. The barn was gone, destroyed by Sterling's greed and transformed by the very treasure it had protected. But what it had guarded for generations continued to give life to the community that had grown around it. "You know what the strangest part is?" he said to Violet, as they watched their neighbor's children splash in the pool the well had created. "I never would have found the courage to dig if Sterling hadn't threatened me. His greed forced me to be braver than I thought I could be." Violet smiled and took his hand. "Maybe that's the real treasure you found in that old barn. Not just the water, but the strength to stand up for what's right." The water continued to flow as darkness settled over the land, a constant reminder that sometimes the greatest discoveries come to those who dare to see value where others see only worthlessness. And sometimes the smallest investment, 50 cents and a willingness to look deeper, can change not just one life, but an entire community. Everett Kane had bought a barn for 50 cents and found a future worth more than he could have ever imagined. But more than that, he'd discovered something his grandfather had tried to teach him all along, that true wealth isn't measured in what you own, but in what you give and what you stand for when tested. The Henderson Well would flow for generations, sustaining life and prosperity long after everyone who witnessed its discovery had passed into memory, and with it would flow the story of a young man who refused to be intimidated, a community that found its courage, and a treasure that proved most valuable when shared freely with all who needed it.